Before we start, one thing. When the moment hits, drop one word in the comments, just one. Whatever the story did to you, I read every single one every time. Now, what follows is a conversation. It takes place in the break room of the Galactic Medical Cooperative Station 12 facility, approximately 6 hours after the most discussed shift in the facility's history. The speakers are 4 members of the medical staff. They have been on duty for 14 hours. They are tired. They are eating, and they cannot stop talking about the human. The one speaking first is Senior Nurse Vethralen. She has been working in the Galactic Medical Cooperative for 31 years. She has treated 412 species. She has seen things that would be difficult to describe to anyone who was not there. She began the conversation by sitting down very heavily in her chair, putting her meal tray on the table, looking at it for a long moment, and then saying, "I need someone to explain to me what happened today. Not medically. I understand what happened medically. I have read the charts and I understand what the readings said, and I understand what the readings should have meant. I need someone to explain to me how those two things can both be true. Because I have been in medicine for 31 years and they cannot both be true, and they were both true, and I watched it happen, and I still do not fully understand it." Junior physician Rathvelsorn, who was sitting across from her, and was in the 7th year of his residency, and who had, until today, considered himself adequately prepared for most medical situations, said, "I have been trying to explain it to myself for the past 3 hours." He said this while staring at his own food with the specific expression of someone who wants to eat but keeps getting distracted by the thing they cannot stop thinking about. "I keep going back to the initial readings," he said. The initial readings were clear. They were unambiguous. There was nothing in those readings that was consistent with continued biological function. I showed them to Dr. Kethvasorn and she looked at them and she said, "And I want to be precise about this," she said. "Prepare the documentation. Because the documentation is what you prepare when the readings say what those readings said and there is no more medical intervention to attempt." We prepared the documentation. And then the human sat up. Dr. Kethvasorn herself, who was the senior physician on the case and who had been practicing medicine for 62 years across 14 galactic medical facilities, and who had, in those 62 years, developed what she believed was a comprehensive understanding of what biological systems can and cannot do, said, "I was not in the room when it happened. I want that on the record. I had stepped out to consult with the specialist from the Biological Systems Department about the readings, specifically to confirm what the readings said because they were so clear that I wanted a second confirmation before I signed the documentation. I was gone for approximately 8 minutes. When I came back, Nurse Vethralen was standing outside the room looking like she had seen something that she was still in the process of deciding whether to believe. And I said, "What happened?" And she said, "It sat up." And I said, "What sat up?" And she said, "The human." And I said, "That is not possible." And she said, "I know." And we stood there for a moment, and then I went into the room, and the human was sitting up, and it looked at me, and it said something in its language, and the translation system rendered it as, "I am very hungry. Is there food here?" There was a pause after Dr. Kethvasorn finished this account. The fourth member of the group, medical technician Drath Savel, who had been working at Station 12 for 11 years and who had processed the initial readings, and had therefore been the first member of the staff to see the numbers that had led to the documentation preparation, said, "I want to describe what the readings actually showed, for the record, and for my own sanity, because I have been second-guessing myself all day, and I need to say it out loud and have other people confirm that I read them correctly." The initial readings showed neurological activity at approximately 4% of species standard baseline, cardiovascular function at 8% of species standard baseline, core temperature at a level that, in any of the 412 species in our standard care database, would be associated with the final stages of systemic failure, cellular regeneration indicators at 0. I want to emphasize that last one. Cellular regeneration at 0 means the biological system has stopped the process of repairing itself. When biological systems stop repairing themselves, they do not restart. That is not a statement about human biology specifically. That is a statement about biology in general, biological system. That have stopped the repair process do not spontaneously restart the repair process. And then the human's repair process restarted. Nurse Vethralin said, I was in the room when the readings changed. I want to describe what that was like because I think the description matters. I was checking the monitoring equipment, not because I expected the readings to change, but because checking the equipment is what you do when you are waiting for the documentation to be signed, and there is nothing else medically to be done. It is something to do. It makes you feel useful in a situation where you are not useful anymore. So I was checking the equipment and the readings were what they had been and then they changed. Not gradually. Not in the way readings change when a biological system is recovering gradually, in small increments responding to treatment. They change the way readings change when a biological system makes a decision. Abruptly. Several indicators simultaneously. I looked at the monitoring equipment and I thought, the equipment is malfunctioning. And then I looked at the human and it was moving. Not the involuntary movements that biological systems sometimes produce near the end. Intentional movement. It was moving its upper limbs. It was pushing itself into an upright position. It was sitting up. And I thought very clearly in the specific way that you think things when you are watching something that you are not sure is actually happening. That is not possible. And then the human was sitting up. And it looked at me. And it made sounds that the translation system in the room rendered as, "Oh good, you are here. I am quite hungry. Do you have anything to eat?" And I said, and I am not proud of this as a professional response, but it is what I said, "You were dead." Junior physician Rathvelsorn said, "What did it say to that?" Nurse Vethralin said, "It looked at me for a moment, and then it said, 'Well, I feel better now,' and then it said, 'Seriously though, I am very hungry. Is there a kitchen in this place?'" There was another pause. Then Dr. Kethvasorn said, "When I came into the room and found the human sitting up and apparently oriented and requesting food, I did what any physician would do in that situation. I ran a full assessment. Not because I thought the assessment would show what the previous assessment had shown, clearly something had changed, but because I needed to understand what had changed and how and what the current biological status actually was. The assessment took approximately 20 minutes. The human was cooperative throughout, though it did mention food 4 more times during the assessment. When the assessment was complete, I looked at the results for a long time. And then I looked at the human, and I said, "You are fine." And the human said, "I told you I was fine. I just needed a minute," and I said, "Your readings indicated that you were not fine. Your readings indicated that you were experiencing systemic failure across multiple critical biological systems." And the human said, "Yeah, that happens sometimes." And I said, "That happens sometimes." And it said, "I have been through worse. Do you have eggs here? Does anyone in this galaxy have eggs? I am really very hungry." Medical technician Drath Savel said, "I have been processing the follow-up readings all afternoon, and I want to share what I found because I think it is the most medically significant data from this entire encounter, and I have not been able to figure out what to do with it." The follow-up readings, taken at the conclusion of Dr. Kethvasorn's assessment, showed the human's biological systems at approximately 92% of species standard baseline. I want to be clear about what that means. In the time between the initial readings, which showed systemic function at 4 to 8% of baseline, and the follow-up readings, taken approximately 2 hours later, the human's biological system had gone from 4 to 8% of baseline to 92% of baseline. That is an increase of approximately 85 percentage points in 2 hours, without medical intervention, without treatment. The human was not given anything. We were preparing the documentation. Nobody was treating it because the reading said there was nothing to treat. The human recovered 85 percentage points of baseline biological function in 2 hours with no medical assistance. I have been in medical technology for 11 years. I have processed readings from 412 species. I do not know what to do with this data. Dr. Kethvasorn said, "I consulted with the biological systems specialist about the follow-up readings. I want to describe that conversation because I think it is relevant. The specialist, who has a doctorate in xenobiology and 40 years of experience with non-standard biological cases, reviewed the initial readings and the follow-up readings side by side for approximately 10 minutes without saying anything. Then she said, "These are from the same individual." I said, "Yes." She said, "Taken 2 hours apart." I said, "Yes." She said, "The individual received no treatment between these two readings." I said, "Correct." She was quiet for another few minutes. Then she said, "I want to see the individual." I said, "I can arrange that." She said, "Does it need anything?" I said, "It has been asking for food since it regained consciousness." She said, "Give it food. I want to see it while it is eating." She came to the room. The human was eating. We had found some nutritional provisions that were compatible with its biology, and it was consuming them with what I would describe as significant enthusiasm. The specialist stood at the door for a while watching the human eat. Then she said to no one in particular, "It is not doing anything. It is just eating." I said, "Yes." She said, "There is nothing special happening. It is just a biological system processing nutrition." I said, "Yes." She said, "How is that possible? How is a biological system that was at 4 to 8% of baseline 2 hours ago now sitting there eating in a way that I would describe as enthusiastic?" I said, "I do not know. That is why I called you." She said, "I do not know either." The human looked up from its food and said, "Is something wrong?" The specialist said, "We are trying to understand how you are alive." The human thought about this for a moment. Then it said, "I am very hard to kill. Also, this food is excellent. What is it?" Nurse Vethralin said, "I have been thinking about the 'I am very hard to kill' comment for the past 6 hours." She said this in the tone of someone who has been thinking about something for 6 hours and has not resolved it. She said, "It said it very casually. Not as a boast. Not in the way someone says something to impress you. In the way someone says something that is simply true and that they have known for a long time, and that does not feel particularly remarkable to them. Like saying I have brown hair, I am very hard to kill, the same register, the same level of significance." Junior physician Rath Velsorn said, "That is what disturbs me most, I think. Not the readings, not the recovery, the casualness. Because casualness implies familiarity, implies this is not the first time. Implies the human has been in situations before where its readings would have said what our readings said, and has recovered, and has found the recovery unremarkable enough that it does not comment on it except when specifically asked." He said, "I looked up the human's medical history after the shift. What is available in the shared galactic medical database? There is not much. Humans have only been in contact with the galactic community for a relatively short time, and their medical records integration is incomplete. But what there is includes 2 previous documented instances of the human being treated at galactic medical facilities. In one of those instances, the treating physician's notes include the phrase, 'Patient exhibited unexpected resilience and was discharged in good health.' In the other, the notes include, 'Patient recovery inconsistent with injury severity.' Standard documentation, professional language, reading between the lines of both of those. This has happened before. The human has been, by galactic medical standards, in situations where the reading said one thing and the human did another. More than once." Dr. Kethvasorn said, "I want to tell you what the human said when I asked it directly about its recovery. I asked it because I am a physician, and because I needed information, and because I have 62 years of practice and I have never not asked a patient a question I needed the answer to regardless of how unusual the situation was. I said, 'Can you describe, from your own perspective, what happened during the period when our readings indicated systemic failure?' The human thought about this for a while. It was still eating. It finished the item it was eating and then it said, 'I was very tired.' I said, 'Tired?' It said, 'Yes, like extremely tired. Everything hurt and I could not keep my eyes open and I thought, okay, I am going to rest for a while.' I said, 'Rest?' It said, 'Yes. I was going to rest until I felt better.' I said, 'Our readings indicated that you were not going to feel better. That the biological indicators associated with recovery were absent.' The human looked at me with the expression I have come to associate with humans who are being patient with something they find slightly puzzling. It said, 'Your readings were wrong.' I said, 'Our readings are not typically wrong.' The human said, I know you think that. But I was there, and what I was experiencing was very bad pain and very bad fatigue, and I decided to rest until it passed, and it passed. I said, and if it had not passed, the human considered this. Then it said, I suppose I would have rested longer. It said this in the same tone, the same register, as though a extended rest was a reasonable response to the kind of biological failure that our readings had indicated. I looked at it for a long time. It looked back at me with the patient expression. Then it said, I appreciate the concern, really. Can I have more of that food? Medical technician Drath Savel said, I want to raise something that I think is important and that I have been hesitant to raise because it is outside my area of expertise. But I have been sitting with it all afternoon and I think it needs to be said. He said, the readings I processed this morning were accurate. I have checked the equipment 3 times. The equipment was functioning correctly. The readings said what the readings said. Systemic failure indicators across multiple critical biological systems, and the human recovered, without treatment, in 2 hours, and is now eating enthusiastically in Bay 7. He said, those 2 things are both true, and the only way I can make them both true simultaneously is if our understanding of what those readings mean for this specific species is incorrect. Which means that the criteria we use to determine when intervention is no longer viable, the criteria that led us to prepare the documentation, may not apply to humans the way they apply to other species. He said, and if that is true, I want to know how many other things about human biology we are applying the wrong criteria to. Because the criteria matter. The criteria determine what we do and what we do not do, and when we make decisions that cannot be undone. And if our criteria for this species are wrong, we need to know that, not just for this case, for every future case. Nurse Vethralin said, you are right, that is the important thing, that is the thing that goes in the report. Junior physician Rath Velsorn said, I have already started writing the report. It is going to be a long report. Dr. Keth Vassorn said, make sure the part about the breakfast question is in there. Junior physician Rath Velsorn said, I am not leaving out the breakfast question. The breakfast question is the whole case in 3 words. They were quiet for a while after that. The break room had the specific quality of quiet that rooms have when a group of people have all been through the same thing and have talked about it from every angle they can find and have run out of new angles but are not ready to stop talking about it yet. Then Nurse Vethralin said, can I say something that is not in the report? Dr. Keth Vassorn said, this is the break room, not the report. Say what you want. She said, I have been in medicine for 31 years. I have treated 412 species. I have seen things that were hard to explain medically. I have seen recoveries that were faster than expected. I have seen patients who were stronger than their readings suggested. These things happen. Biology is complex and our models are imperfect, and sometimes the models are wrong in ways that produce better outcomes than expected. I have made my peace with this over 31 years. This is different. This is not a recovery that was faster than expected. This is a recovery from a condition that our entire medical framework says recovery is not possible from. Not unlikely, not rare, not possible. And the human recovered from it and asked for breakfast. And the thing I cannot stop thinking about is that it was not surprised. It was not relieved. It was not grateful in the way that beings who have been through something frightening tend to be grateful. It was just hungry. It had been through the thing that our framework says is not survivable, and it had come out the other side, and its primary concern was breakfast. She said, I want to know what it is like to be something that goes through that and comes out the other side asking for breakfast. I want to know what that specific quality is that produces that specific response. Because I think it is the most remarkable thing I have seen in 31 years of medicine, and it was not even the most remarkable thing about this case. The most remarkable thing about this case was the readings. But the most remarkable thing to me, personally, right now, 6 hours after it happened, is the breakfast question. Junior physician Rath Velsorn said, I actually asked it. After Dr. Keth Vassorn finished the assessment and the xenobiology specialist had come and gone, and the human had eaten its second helping of the nutritional provision and was looking considerably more comfortable. I went back in and I asked it. I said, "Can I ask you something personal?" It said, "Sure." I said, "When you were in the condition our readings indicated, when you were at the point our medical framework would describe as non-recoverable, what were you thinking about?" The human looked at me for a moment. Then it said, "I was thinking about getting better." I said, "Were you afraid?" It considered this. It said, "I was very uncomfortable." I said, "But not afraid." It said, "ID. Oh, not no, maybe. I was mostly focused on the getting better part." I said, "What made you confident you would get better?" It said, "I was not confident exactly. I just assumed I would." I said, "On what basis?" And the human looked at me with what I had begun to recognize as its patient expression, and it said, "On the basis that I usually do." And I said, "You have been in this condition before." And it said, "Not this exact condition, but bad conditions." And I said, "And you always recovered." And it said, "So far." And I said, "And that is enough. Assuming you will recover because you have recovered before." And the human thought about this for a moment. And then it said something that I have been sitting with for the past several hours and that I put in the report but that I want to say out loud as well. It said, "I think the assuming is part of the recovering. I think if I stopped assuming I would recover, recovering would get harder, so I just assume." And then it asked for a third helping of the nutritional provision, and said it was really very good and asked what it was made of. Dr. Kethvasorn said, "I want to tell you about a conversation I had with the xenobiology specialist after she left the human's room. She came to find me specifically and she said, 'I need to talk to you about something that is not in the medical literature.' I said, 'Everything about this case is not in the medical literature.' She said, 'This is specifically not in the medical literature.' She said, 'I have been studying xenobiology for 40 years. I have published work on the biological resilience of 43 species. I have a theory that I have been developing for about 15 years that I have not published because I do not have sufficient evidence for it, and I did not think I would ever have sufficient evidence for it.' And then she told me the theory. She said, 'I believe that in certain species, the boundary between biological function and biological cessation is not as fixed as our medical models assume. That the models assume a threshold. Below this threshold, the system is not viable. Above it, the system is viable, and that this threshold is accurate for most species. But for some species, the threshold is not a line. It is a zone. And within that zone, the direction of travel matters as much as the position. A system that is in the zone and moving downward through it will continue downward. A system that is in the zone and decides to move upward through it can do so." She said, "The human's readings this morning put it in the zone, moving downward. We assessed it as past the threshold because our model assumes the threshold is a line, but it was in the zone, and something made it move upward. And I think the something was the thing it said when it woke up. 'I am very hungry.' That is not the communication of something that has decided it is done. That is the communication of something that has decided it has things to do." The specialist said, "I think the deciding is part of the biology. I think in some species the decision to continue is not separate from the biological capacity to continue. They are the same thing, and I think the humans are one of those species." Dr. Kethvasorn paused. Then she said, "I told her she should publish that theory. She said she would think about it. I think she is going to publish it. I think it is going to change how we approach certain cases." Nurse Vethralin said, "The human asked me something before I left its room at the end of my shift. She said this in the tone of someone who had been deciding whether to mention it. She said, 'I went to check on it one more time before I handed off to the night shift, and it was sitting up in the bed, which it had been doing since it regained consciousness. It did not want to lie down. It said lying down reminded it of how it had felt earlier and it preferred sitting up. And it had finished eating and it was looking out the viewport at the stars. And I said, 'How are you feeling?' And it said, 'Much better, thank you.' And then it said, 'Can I ask you something?' And I said, 'Yes.' And it said, 'The equipment you were using to monitor me, the readings that showed I was in bad shape, does that equipment tell you what the patient is thinking?' And I said, 'No. It tells us about biological function, neurological activity, cardiovascular function, cellular processes.' It does not tell us about thought content. The human nodded at this in the way that humans nod when they have received an answer they expected. And then it said, I thought so. Because the whole time the readings were showing whatever they showed, I was thinking very clearly. It was uncomfortable and I was tired, but I knew what I was thinking. I was thinking, this is temporary. I was thinking, I just need to rest and it will pass. And I was thinking about food. She said, I told it that was interesting. She said, it said, I imagine it looked pretty bad from outside. I said, the readings were very concerning. It saw. I figured. I tried to communicate that I was okay, but I was too tired to move, she said, and that was the last thing it said to me. I tried to communicate that I was okay, but I was too tired to move. I have been thinking about that for 6 hours. It was trying to tell us. From inside whatever the readings were showing, it was trying to communicate that it was okay. And our equipment could not hear it. Medical technician Drath Savel said, I want to share something from the technical side that I think is relevant to what you just said. When I reviewed the readings timeline this afternoon, the full timeline, minute by minute, from admission to the point where the human regained consciousness, I found something in the neurological data that I missed on first review because I was looking at the summary indicators rather than the detailed readings. The summary indicator for neurological activity showed 4% of species standard baseline. That is what I reported. That is what went into the documentation. But when I looked at the detailed neurological readings at the granular level, the pattern of activity was not what I would expect from a system at 4% function. A system at 4% neurological function produces a specific pattern. Low, irregular, scattered. The pattern in the detailed readings was different. Low, yes, but not scattered, focused. The activity that was present was in a very specific cluster of neurological structures, he said. I showed this to the xenobiology specialist this afternoon. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, those structures are associated with intentional cognitive function, deliberate thought, planning, goal-oriented cognition. She said, at 4% of baseline, the system was devoting almost all of its remaining neurological resources to deliberate thought. He said, the human was not at 4% and scattered. The human was at 4% and entirely focused on something. The question is what it was focused on. And based on what it told Nurse Veth Ralen, we know what it was focused on. It was focused on getting better. It was devoting every available neurological resource to the specific cognitive task of deciding to recover. He said, I do not know what to do with this information medically. I know it is significant. Junior physician Rath Velsorn said, I want to tell you about the moment in my conversation with the human where I stopped trying to explain it and started just listening. He said, I was asking it questions about its experience of the recovery, and it was answering them in the patient and slightly amused way that it seemed to have with most of my questions. And at some point I asked, do you have a word for what you did? What you were doing while you were recovering? And it thought about this for a moment. And then it said, resting, I guess, but not the kind of resting where you stop. The kind of resting where you gather. He said, I asked it to explain the difference. It said, when I rest in the regular way, I stop doing things. When I was resting this morning, I was not stopping, I was gathering. Everything that was still working was pointed at the same thing. He said, I said, what thing? It said, getting up. He said, and I said, at what point did you know you were going to get up? And it said, without hesitation, the whole time. He said, I said, you never doubted it, and it said, what would be the point of doubting it? He said, I did not have an answer to that. I have been trained for 7 years in medicine and I did not have an answer to what would be the point of doubting it. I have been thinking about that question all afternoon. What is the point of doubting in a situation like that? And the answer I keep arriving at is, there is no point, and doubting it would consume resources that should be devoted to the getting up. The human does not doubt because doubting is an inefficient use of the resources needed for recovery. That is not a spiritual insight. That is biology. That is how it works in them. The not doubting is part of the mechanism. Dr. Kethvasorn said, I want to say something about what we did today that I think needs to be said and that I do not know how to include in the formal report. She said, we prepared the documentation. We were going to sign the documentation. We were, by every protocol we have and every piece of training we have received and every reading we had in front of us, doing the right thing. The protocols are the protocols because they work. Because they are based on evidence from hundreds of species and thousands of cases and the accumulated knowledge of galactic medicine. We were following the protocols correctly, she said, and the human recovered anyway, and is currently in Bay 7 probably asking the night shift nurse about food. She said, I'm not saying the protocols are wrong. I am saying the protocols do not yet include the humans, not fully, not the way they need to, and that is a gap that we created today's documentation about. The documentation about what happened today is the most important documentation I have signed in 62 years of medicine. Not because it describes something wonderful, though it does. Because it describes something we did not understand and need to understand better. Because it tells us that our protocols have an edge case. That there is a species for which the threshold is not a line, and the deciding is part of the biology, and the 4% neurological activity is focused rather than scattered, and the recovery is being driven by deliberate cognition, rather than by anything we can measure and intervene in. She said, the protocols will need to be revised. I am going to write the recommendation myself. It will take a while. It will be a significant revision. But the human sat up and asked for breakfast, and we need to make sure we know what to do when that happens again. Because it will happen again. I am already certain it will happen again. They finished their meals. The break room had been occupied for approximately 90 minutes by this point. The night shift had begun outside. Bay 7 was quiet. The human had, according to the last check, asked for a blanket and had said it was going to sleep properly this time, which it distinguished from what it had done earlier with a phrase the translation system rendered as that was not really sleeping, that was more of an emergency rest. The four of them sat for a while after the conversation wound down in the comfortable quiet of people who have said most of what they needed to say and are still processing the remainder. Then Nurse Vethralen said, 31 years, 412 species. She said this not as a complaint and not as a boast, as a measurement, something to locate herself against. She said, I thought I had seen most of what there was to see. Dr. Kethvasorn said, 62 years. She said it the same way. Medical technician Drathsavel said, 11 years. He paused. Then he said, I feel like this is my first day. Junior physician Rathvelsorn said, 7 years. He paused. Then he said, I think this is the most useful shift I have ever worked. Dr. Kethvasorn said, yes, I think that is right. She picked up her tray and stood up. She said, I am going to check on it one more time before I leave. Make sure it has everything it needs. Junior physician Rathvelsorn said, tell it the food is a nutritional composite made primarily from 3 of the local agricultural products in the station's garden. Nurse Vethralen said, why, he said, because it asked me what it was made of 3 times and I kept not knowing and I found out this afternoon and I think it deserves the information. Dr. Kethvasorn said, I will tell it. She left the break room. The other 3 sat for a moment longer. Then medical technician Drathsavel said, do you think it will come back? Nurse Vethralen said, I think it will be fine. He said, I know. I meant do you think it will come back here to the station? She thought about this. Then she said, I would not be surprised. Junior physician Rathvelsorn said, if it does, I am going to make sure we have the nutritional composite ready. It really did seem to enjoy it. They sat a little while longer. Outside, the station turned slowly in its orbit. And in Bay 7, the human slept in the specific deep, an uncomplicated way of something that had needed to rest and had rested and was done with the hard part and ready for whatever came next. 2 months after the events described in this conversation, the Galactic Medical Cooperative Station 12 published a paper in the Journal of Xenobiological Medicine. The paper was authored by Dr. Kethvasorn, medical technician Drathsavel, junior physician Rathvelsorn, and senior nurse Vethralen, along with the xenobiology specialist whose theory about the zone and the direction of travel was, as predicted, included. The paper was titled, Biological Resilience Indicators in Homo sapiens, a preliminary case study and protocol recommendations. It ran to 47 pages. It described the case in full clinical detail, with the complete readings timeline and the neurological data analysis and the xenobiology specialist's theoretical framework. It included a section on the limitations of current assessment protocols when applied to human patients, and a set of recommendations for revised protocols that would account for what the authors described as the potential for recovery-directed cognition to influence biological function in ways not captured by standard measurement. The paper was downloaded from the journal archive more times in its first month than any previous paper in the journal's history. It was cited in the medical literature of 11 different galactic civilizations within 6 months of publication. The xenobiology specialist published her full theory as a separate paper the following year. It is now considered foundational reading in xenobiological resilience studies. None of this is what any of the 4 authors expected when they sat down to write the paper. What they expected was to document a case that needed documenting. What they produced was the document that changed how galactic medicine approaches human patients. The human, for its part, never knew the paper existed. It was discharged the morning after the conversation in the break room, in good health, with a supply of the nutritional composite that the station's kitchen had prepared at its request, and a note from Dr. Kethvasorn that said, "Please come back if you need us, and do not hesitate to tell us what you are thinking. Our equipment cannot hear you, but we can." There is a follow-up note in the Station 12 patient record for the human, added 14 months after the original case. It reads, "The patient returned to Station 12 for a routine check-in during a layover. The patient was in excellent health. The patient recognized Nurse Vethralen in the corridor and stopped to say hello. They spoke for approximately 20 minutes. Nurse Vethralen's account of the conversation, filed with the patient record, reads as follows. The patient asked how we were. I said we were well. It asked if the xenobiology specialist had published anything. I said yes and described the paper briefly. It seemed pleased about this. It said, I hope it helps. I said, I think it will. It said, good. Then it said, I have been thinking about something you said when I first woke up. I said, what did I say? It said, you said you were dead. I said that you were dead. It said, yes. And I have been thinking about the gap between those two things. What your equipment said and what was actually happening. It said, I think that gap is important. I think a lot of things that look finished from outside are still very much in progress from inside. And I think your equipment is getting better at seeing that, which is good. I said, we wrote a paper about it. It said, I know, I read it. It said it was good. I thanked it. It said, the food was also good. I said we still had the recipe. It said, excellent. Can I have some before I leave? I gave it a supply of the nutritional composite. It left. Nurse Vethralen's note ends. I think it will come back again. I hope it does. End of record. The gap between what the equipment said and what was actually happening. The human said that in a station corridor 14 months after the case, to a nurse who had prepared documentation declaring it deceased. And it was right. There is a gap, not just in galactic medicine and not just for humans. In every situation where something is being measured and judged from outside, there is a gap between what the measurement captures and what is actually happening inside. The equipment measures what it can measure: biological function, neurological activity, cardiovascular performance. What it cannot measure is the neurological activity that is focused rather than scattered, devoted to a specific task, gathered around a single clear intention. What it cannot measure is the deciding. What it cannot measure is the part of the biological system that is still oriented toward getting up, still planning what to eat for breakfast, still very much in progress despite looking from the outside like it is finished. 31 years of medicine, 412 species, and the thing that changes everything is a species that looks dead from outside and is planning breakfast from inside. That is the whole story. That is the whole lesson. The gap between what you look like and what you actually are can be very large. What you look like is for the people with the equipment. What you actually are is for you. And what this species actually is in its worst moments is something that is resting, gathering, and already thinking about what comes next. Drop one word in the comments. Whatever this did to you. I am reading every single one. Subscribe to UG Human HFY. The next episode is a completely different voice, a completely different angle. That is the promise. The lesson that 4 alien medical professionals took home from that shift is a lesson that medicine has been learning about humans since the first human arrived in a galactic medical facility. The lesson is this: the criteria do not fully apply, not because human biology is magical, not because they are invulnerable. They are not invulnerable. The readings this morning showed that clearly. They were genuinely in a state of significant systemic failure. The criteria were reading the situation accurately. What they were not reading accurately was what would happen next, because what happened next was that the human assumed it would get better, and the assuming, apparently, is part of the recovering. 31 years of medicine, 412 species, and the lesson that still surprises the nurse is the simplest one. What you believe about what happens next changes what happens next. Not always, not in every case, not enough to overcome every biological reality, but enough. In the humans, enough. They assume they will get better, and they usually do. And the times they do not, they were trying to. The breakfast question is not a joke. It is the whole case. A being that comes out of the thing our framework says is not survivable and asks what is for breakfast is a being that never, not for a single moment, stopped assuming there would be a breakfast. Drop one word in the comments. Whatever this story did to you, I am waiting for it. Subscribe to UG Human HFY. Next episode is completely different voice, completely different angle. That is the promise. Every time.